I'd like to thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and I'm one of the people in charge of this project with Pharma Disclosure. As you can see, the snow did not come. We can thank the Dutch snow gods for making sure we could all get here today, and I'd like to thank you all for being here. The purpose of today is to discuss the disclosure code that has gone live. As you may be aware, as of 29 days ago, all records of financial transfers of value to practitioners in Europe are now being recorded. Now, they're not public yet, but the databases are in place. So as of January 1st, 2016, this data will be made public, and the process is now live. So we've gone live. And so today we're here in the Netherlands because the Dutch are one of the first countries that actually had a process in place, and we're very grateful for their sponsorship and hosting us today, NIPHARMA. So the supporters today are NIPHARMA. Obviously, they're the main sponsor of today, as well as InPharma, PGEU, and EFPIA. Those are the main sponsors of this initiative, and we're very grateful for their support. The topics of discussion today are the actual financial disclosure and public policy. How is it going from a policy perspective across Europe? And then we're also talking about the actual implementation in the member states, and that's where we're going to get into how things have gone in the Netherlands versus how things have gone into Poland, how they're going, and we'll look at Germany as well. And we're going to compare and contrast how things have been implemented. So I'd like to begin by inviting the first panel up to discuss the policy aspects. And if they're here, please come, if I can join the podium. This is Lodi Wiggersma, Karen Smand, Anne Brita Haas, and Bernard Mallet, and Kees Smit, who will be presenting today. So thank you very much. So we'd like to begin with the Dutch perspective, and Lodi Wiggersma has been one of the key people involved in implementing this code from the practitioner perspective in the Netherlands. And Lodi, we'd like to give you the floor for 10 minutes to talk about how you've done that. So thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the organizing parties for inviting me to tell you something about disclosure measures in the Netherlands. Until a month ago, I was CEO of the Royal Dutch Medical Association. I'm still involved in the CGR, which is the Dutch foundation for the regulation of pharmaceutical advertisements. I'd just like to dwell a while on what happened, how we organize it in the Netherlands. Our foundation, which consists of all parties concerned, as you see here, like the pharmaceutical umbrella organization, the pharma, my organization, the doctors, the pharmacists, the drugstores. We established the Foundation for the Regulation of Drug Advertising, and that was after inspection of healthcare, inspectors of healthcare unveiled many unethical ties between industry and professionals. And we all know about that. Maybe it's history, maybe sometimes it's still actual in some countries, but it was like paid luxurious holiday trips, etc. And the objectives of our foundation, which now exists 15 years, was to develop a code of practice, to supervise the application of the code, and to collaborate with the inspection of healthcare to see, well, what are the legal aspects and what are the self-regulatory aspects. The code regulates a number of things. You can read them here. Hospitality at conferences and events, gifts, payments, sponsoring, financial support of patient organizations, not unimportant, as you will know. Advertising at conferences aimed at prescribing and non-prescribing professionals and the general public. And last but not least, that's what we are talking about today, the disclosure of financial relations between industry and professionals. Why did we choose this way of organizing the regulation? Because we could also have chosen the legal regulation. Well, we did this, and it was in accordance with what our government found useful. And the three reasons why we did it are closely related, as you can see, because we think and we know that only a shared responsibility of all parties concerned can create broad support for the measures. The government was understandably reluctant to establish legal regulation because that is certain to elicit resistance. And we have also noticed, and it has been proven in the last 15 years, that gradual persuasion of parties concerned works better than forbidding regulation, although it takes a little time. We have, time and again, we have evaluated what doctors think of the code of the self-regulation in this field. And the last survey, which was conducted in 2014, proves that a large part of doctors, about 80 to 90%, know the code rules about sponsoring, payments, etc., value of gifts allowed, payment by industry of services, and rules for attending conferences abroad. And this is a steady finding since 2009. And doctors, they abide by the rules, they know about the rules, sympathize with them, and generally comply well. Which is a good finding because, let's say, in the beginning of our organization 10 years ago, that was not the case. Our disclosure code was developed in 2013. The scope you see here is restricted to relations of certain intensity and economic value. All above 500 euros a year per event or action, and that is because everything below has been regulated already in the code. Educational materials are excluded, clinical trials are excluded because they are disclosed elsewhere. Devices will be gradually included because the whole discussion about devices started a lot later, only 2 years ago. And we are now so far that devices will, in the very near future, be generally included also in the disclosure code and in the transparency register. And we have made our code in tune last year with the EFPIA code. And all the transactions are annually published in the transparency register with this, which is publicly accessible. Something about the perspective and the development, also from my professional organization, seen from my professional organization. As we have conducted extensive information campaigns before we launched the transparency register, there was not much resistance among professionals. Generally, parties concerned like scientific colleges, etc., found it a logical step, and there has not been much, let's say, formal resistance. I'll come to that later. We conducted an evaluation of the transparency register end of last year, and it appeared that 80% of doctors are positive and about 20% are negative, in the sense that they find it patronizing or even sometimes outrageous that this should be necessary. And what was a bit of a strange finding is that 17% of doctors who are registered in the transparency register do not know about the transparency register. So although they get information about it every time that says that you are present in the register, they don't know about it. So we have some work to do there. What we intend to do and what we still do and what we will continue to do is to give continuous information aimed at doctors and other target groups to learn the transparency register's objectives and to accept it. So it is a continuous work like we did with the CGR code. We have to do it here as well. I mean, it's not a question of that everyone knows about it and accepts it in 2 years. You have to keep on informing them. And as I already said, devices, especially orthopedic and cardiac devices, will be included with full cooperation of the scientific colleges of medical specialties. So that will happen next year. This is what I had to say, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Lodi. Lodi, you mentioned that 10 years ago, it was not the case that there was a lot of trust between the profession and the doctors, and yet now you're the first country in Europe that's actually managed to get an operational transparency and disclosure code. How did you bridge that gap? How did you make that happen? What was the process? Because obviously the practitioners were deeply involved. How did that work? What did you try to do from a practitioner perspective to bring people along?
I think I think we should not underestimate what I said in the beginning, the actions of the Inspectorate of Healthcare. They were very fierce in those days, like it was in the beginning around the year 2000. They really dragged practitioners for the judge because they did things that were, they were not only unethical but really forbidden. It's like, so there was an incentive, not alone to establish the foundation, but also for doctors to go and think about it. Think, well, what are we doing here? We go on ski holidays, fully paid by the industry, and don't do anything there. So then skiing, of course. So I mean, that's what started the idea, the knowledge with my professional group that something had to be done there. And that was accompanied, of course, by our information campaign, what we did very intensively, that this was unethical, and it's not so hard to sum up the reasons why it's unethical. So it took some time, but doctors started to understand that this couldn't be accepted anymore. So it's mainly a question of the right information at the right spot with the good arguments.
And we'll have more time. We're leaving a half hour for questions from the audience. So we're going to move on now. Lodi, thank you very much. Excellent.
Welcome.
And we'd like to move on now to Karen Smaan. Now, Karen, she leads one of the largest patient groups across Europe, the Hematology Association, and we'd like to have her perspective on this. So thank you, Karen.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I also would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and to share some of the views of the European Hematology Association on transparency and disclosures. Something about the European Hematology Association to start with. A membership organization, a non-profit organization at the European level, located in the Netherlands, in that respect the office. Founded in 1992. We organize, like many other medical, European medical organizations, membership organizations. We organize a congress, we organize medical education, we work on guidelines, we lobby in Brussels, and so I think we do all together with our colleagues in the medical field a lot of the same things. And yes, we are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. And I think that's also what we have in common. So we looked at the EFPIA code and we looked at what does it mean for healthcare professional organizations and specifically the European Hematology Association. First of all, the EFPIA code, of course, enables public scrutiny and understanding of the relationship between pharma, healthcare professional organizations and healthcare professionals. And it should and could contribute to the confidence of stakeholders in pharma, healthcare professional organizations and healthcare professionals as such. However, there are two issues I would like to discuss with you. First of all, we disclose as doctors do, as other medical specialty organizations do, but what exactly is disclosed? And after the disclosure, then what? Because you can look at euros, you can look at the labels connected to these euros, but there needs to be a follow-up. So address the first issue a little bit. The transfer of euros with labels is what we are looking at currently. We look at databases, we look at numbers, we see names of doctors, and we see how much they received for certain activities. But the purpose of that is to explain the transfer of value. And that requires explanation regarding these labels, and that also requires guidelines about what can be done and what can't be done. For example, if you look at a scientific advisory board, it's very important for everybody in the chain to understand what a scientific advisory board means. What is the purpose of it? Why is it necessary? And how does it strengthen the relationship between pharma and doctors in order to, for the patient, benefit from that? The second issue is, we disclose, we see all these databases, and then what? And then we have to ask ourselves as European Hematology Association, and I think also all the other healthcare professional organizations, does it contribute to the independence, accountability and responsibility we have as a non-profit membership organization? Is it sufficient, or is more maybe needed? So if we look at it from our point of view, the first issue, no, it's not enough. It's not enough that we only publish an annual report and we show how much EHA received from the pharmaceutical companies. It's also important to explain how we use the money, why we do it, which regulations we have in place, the guidelines applicable to using this funding, and so on. And that requires a continuous communication, explanation on how we add value to the healthcare patients in the end receive. The second issue is to continuously develop, improve and publicize codes of conduct, educational standards and guidelines, good governance policies, and if possible, and I think that's very important, to do that together with all the other healthcare professional organizations, not to do it on your own. Because I think at the end of the day, nobody benefits from more guidelines, more codes. It's very important to have a common understanding about why the relationship is important, but also what the limitations of the relationship are. And to maybe explain a little bit how we do that. Yes, we have a good governance committee, but we also have quite strict rules in place. If we look at our Congress, 11,000 hematologists visited the Congress in Milan last year. But if we have speakers in our Congress program, they are not allowed to speak in a satellite, and the other way around. This is just a small example. There are many more rules in place. But it's important that we discuss these rules with our colleagues and that we try to reach consensus about it and that we implement and behave in a similar way. So that's where we are regarding disclosures, and the ultimate aim is to underline the importance of the relationship between pharma, healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations, including its limitations. Not to frustrate it, not to block it. We are all part of the same chain in the public domain of healthcare, and that comes with a responsibility. And that's what I would like to share with you, and happy to discuss with you if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. One of the key missions that's played by the HCOs is an educational mandate, as sort of a communication and educational mandate between research, new therapies that are coming to market, and the practitioner. That's obviously one of the key roles you do. There was some research from Pierre Mohammed of the NHS a couple years ago. One of the key new therapies, a stratified therapy called Herceptin. 1/3 of Herceptin today is still misprescribed, even though it's a biomarker-based drug. How are the HCOs working in the context of disclosure to continue to enhance this educational mandate? I guess it's a two-part question. One, do you feel you're in any way impeded by disclosure to the educational mandate? And then two, how are you facilitating this under the context of the disclosure code? How is this continuing?
I think it raises an interesting question regarding what medical education, professional medical education is, what it should be, how it best can be organized. And I think if we look at our members and also the non-members, the hematologists in Europe, what we do is We constantly survey, we have competence surveys, we have needs assessments regarding addressing the needs in education. And if a topic comes out, and many topics come out, but it's very important to organize peer-reviewed medical education, to have an independent committee composing the program because the doctors asked for it, and to look at it from a very broad perspective. And the clinical practice of doctors is the starting point. So that's how we look at it, and that's how we organize our medical education program.
Do you think that's going to be easier with the disclosure in the Netherlands?
I don't think so, but I also believe it's a matter of time. Because it's now maybe a little bit unclear what the guidelines should be regarding independent medical education and who can provide independent medical education. And of course I do understand and I do see that the pharmaceutical companies also are involved in medical education. They organize a lot and mostly it's excellent medical education. However, if we are talking about peer-reviewed independent medical education, from a broader point of view, I think healthcare professional organizations can add value.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
One of the things that we need to look at is the sort of legal perspective for this, and we're very grateful today to have Anne-Britta Haas from Clifford Chance, who was one of the, well, for good or for worse, was involved in the drafting of this regulation. So if you have problems with it, you can talk to her afterwards. So Anna's going to discuss how this works from a regulatory perspective legally, how this was put in place, and discuss how Clifford Chance is involved, particularly in Germany, from what I understand, but as well as pan-European. So thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you very much, Ron. Welcome also from my side, and good morning. I'm working at Clifford Chance. We are an international law firm in 36 offices, with 36 offices, and in 25 countries worldwide. And we are focused on the industry sector, healthcare, and advising clients and companies in the sector in all legal areas. And I, for my person, are specialized on compliance, data protection, and IT area, and therefore we have advised many companies with regard to the implementation of this code, with regard to the internal system which have to be implemented in this regard to comply with, in particular, this data protection issue is combined with this code as such. To give you a short overview on this legal background, we have a European Data Protection Directive, in Europe. That means this, the processing of personal data is regulated by a directive which applies in all member states, and all member states have implemented this directive into national law. That means at the bottom, the general principle is the same in all countries. There might be some difference because there is this local implementation, but the guideline is more or less the same, and also the general principles are the same. Therefore, it is more or less possible to make a unique approach within Europe for companies which are working on an international base, and that's in most cases the case. To be noted that in most countries the data protection law applies only to natural persons, that means HCPs in this context, but there are also some member states which have implemented this data protection law also to companies, and if this is the case, then also HCOs are subject to this data protection guidelines, and the requirements have to be fulfilled also with regard to the disclosure of transfer of values to HCOs. This is, for example, the case in Austria, in Greece, in Hungary, in Luxembourg, and in Switzerland. Therefore, in these cases, the following also applies with regard to the transfer of values to HCOs. One general principle of this data protection directive is that each and every processing of personal data needs to be justified either by law or by the consent of the data subject. That means it is not relevant if the transfer or the disclosure of transfer of values is forbidden, but we have to check if it is permitted, either by law or if a law does not exist or a legal justification provided by law, then we have to obtain the consent. And just in a nutshell, the codex as such, the EFPIA codex or the national local implementation by the local pharmaceutical association is not a law in the formal meaning, because it's just a codex by an industry association, and therefore it does not work as justification basis for the disclosure of this personal data. The Data Protection Directive and correspondingly all the national member laws, the data protection member law of the member states, also provide for a so-called contractual fulfillment justification. That means if the contract as such requires a specific type of data processing, then this processing of personal data is also permitted. Unfortunately, it is not required to transfer and to disclose this personal data on an internet site for the fulfillment of the respective contractual relationship with the HCP. Therefore, it's not possible to rely on this justification base. And the other possibility is the so-called interest balance justification. That means processing of data is also permitted if there is a legitimate interest of the company and no overriding interest of the data subject against such use, against such disclosure. But according to the current opinions of courts and data protection authorities, it is not possible to rely on this interest balance justification. Therefore, at the end, we need in most countries the consent. An exception is, of course, possible in the case if that we have such law. That means if the codex has been implemented by a member state into national law, into a formal law, then we can rely on this law and the consent is not required. But that's not the case in most of the member countries in Europe currently. As a consequence, if we need the consent, then it's a question which requirements have to be fulfilled to ensure that such consent is really valid and that the disclosure of this personal data can be justified on base of such consent. And the first requirement is that such consent has to be informed. That means the data subject has to be informed about the specific data which shall be processed, the specific purpose, the specific recipients, and the location where the disclosure will take place, if any other companies, affiliates are included in this transparency process or in the disclosure process, and so on. In addition, the consent needs to be clear. That's also a general requirement of transparency, and it needs to be freely given. That means without any pressure. In some member states, it is required that the consent is given in writing. That means an electronic consent would not be valid in these member states. It's, for example, the case in Germany, but in most other countries it's not required. Nevertheless, it has to be proved that the consent has been given. That means an oral consent would not really work, in fact. If this consent is combined with other text or with the contractual text, then it has to be highlighted from the other text parts. And another requirement is that such consent has to be revocable at any time. That means we have a very high standard in the end to produce such valid consent, and this has to be implemented by the member states, and otherwise the processing, the collecting, and the disclosure of this personal data, of this transfer of value data, would violate against data protection law. And just a very short overview on the possible consequences in case of such data protection law violation. The first thing is that it's possible to obtain a prohibition order by a data protection authority. The data protection authority has also the possibility to trigger administrative fines. It may be a criminal prosecution proceeding, but that's not really the risk is not so high from our perspective. Damage claims of data subject, that means of the HCP, is also possible. And last but not least, of course, the loss in reputation if such unlawful data processing becomes public. One remark at this point, we have I've mentioned that we have a data protection directive currently, which have been issued in 1994, and currently the European community is discussing on a new data protection regulation. That would mean that this regulation would apply directly in all the member states and has not to be implemented by the different member states. And such data protection regulation, or the current draft, provides for fines up to 100 million euro in case of data protection violations. We will see if it will become into force, but we see a high risk that it really will become into force in significantly different level with regard to this administrative fines as it's currently be. If it will be 100 million or 50 million, we will see, and 5% of the annual revenue, or only 3%, but nevertheless, that is really a large number, and therefore we would also recommend to take a look on this data protection issue also in the future with regard to this prospects. That's the short overview from my side, and I'm looking forward to your question now or
Thank
later.
you. Anna, I have just a quick question before we're out of time on your presentation here. There are already several member states that have quite rigorous data protection from the individual perspective. I'm thinking the UK. What is the current legal position on if a medical practitioner would want to opt out from the disclosure code as it is, just based on the legal precedent that's set in their member state? What would happen in that case?
If we would not implement the code?
No, if you've implemented the code and then the doctor says, well, I have a legal right in the UK to opt out, to not declare, because that's given to under my rights and provisions in the United Kingdom. How would that conflict
Normally,
work?
if the codex, the EFPIA codex, and most of the national codex provide for a possibility of aggregate disclosure if the HCP denied the consent. Therefore, you are not obliged to disclose if the consent has not been obtained, and you, from a legal perspective, you would not be permitted because you would violate data protection, or if you would disclose and the consent has not been obtained. Therefore, you have to switch to the aggregate disclosure in this case. And the other question is that, of course, the codec cannot be fulfilled if everything would be disclosed only in an aggregated way. Therefore, the companies should try to obtain the consent and do its very best effort to obtain the consent. It would not be an option for a company to say to a HCP, you are free to grant the consent or not, and if not, no problem, then you make an aggregate disclosure. That would not work in the end because it would, but I think Holger will say in the second panel something on this.
So the buy-in of the practitioner is key in the process. Yeah. Absolutely key.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. So that leads very well. It's almost like we planned it this way. That leads very well to our next presenter, Bernard Maillet, who is one of the representatives of this CPME, which is the Medical Association of Practitioners based in Brussels. We're very glad to have Bernard today. You're going to discuss these issues we've been discussing with Anna from a practitioner perspective. So thank you, Bernard. You have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yep. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me here in the neighboring country, because I'm from Belgium. So I'm representing CPME, one of the medical associations that is organized at European level. We are committed to contributing the medical profession's point of view at European level and in contact with the European Commission and policymakers. And we try to be also proactive. As we are in a meeting about transparency, I will start myself by disclosing my possible conflicts of interests. And I can assure you that I don't have personal interests, financial or others, to give this presentation. Well, what is the background of all these transparency issues? Well, on the one hand, as it has been presented by my predecessor, it's the legislative changes at European level, but also at national level due to some problems that arose in the different countries. And we have also a list of guiding principles promoting good governance in the pharmaceutical sector, and this is led by the European Commission. When we look at transparency, we have always two extremes. On the one, you can say, well, let's go for a complete ban of the support from the industry to physicians and healthcare professionals. Or on the other hand, we can have no control at all, but happened many years ago. And I think that, as usually, the best solution is somewhere in between, a pragmatic solution to have regulation. When we look at how the transparency was perceived many years ago, well, we can say that healthcare professionals were not so much informed or aware of what happened. The regulators a little bit more, and it was mainly the industry who was involved in it. Today we are going to merge a little bit, and in fact, ideally, we should all have nearly the same views on transparency. So in November 2014, the CPME board adopted the guidelines on transparency. And it are standards that are commonly agreed by the medical associations that are represented at European level. But of course, as usually, we don't have to involve the national legislation, so we have to be aware that there can be national differences. So there are some structures in the guidelines, and you can find them in the website of CPME. Of course, we speak about the different topics. For instance, the gifts. We recommend not to accept gifts. We also look at meetings and conferences, which is also in the field of compliance. We have spoken about CME CPD activities, which has also been important. And as it has been said before, I think one of the key issues of organizing CME CPD is to look at the needs assessment and what are the real needs of the profession in order to educate, and this for the best interest of the patient. We have to look at how medical faculties and students are involved, and we want to stress that industry should not be leading the medical education at that level. Of course, we have also to look at the different aspects of research and scientific publications that has been to be fair and balanced, and also how consultancy activities are organized. So I wanted to be quite short, and I look forward to have a discussion and questions, and I hope to be able to answer them.
Well, that was impressive, Bernard. Absolutely impressive. 2.5 minutes. Well done, sir. You win the prize today. Thank you.
Thank you. But I have to declare it afterwards, I think.
Yeah, that's right. It's not a gift. You've earned it. So you mentioned that there's a needs assessment for best interest for activities. What is the current process for that, or is there a process in place? First off. And what is the process to develop that assessment if it doesn't exist? And what would be the ideal process? So a 3-part question.
Well, normally when CME CPD activities are looked at by the accreditation authorities, and I'm part of it in Belgium, we look at the program, and also at European level you have UMS EAC CME who is organizing the accreditation, and we look at the program and we see if it is scientifically based, if there is some needs assessment done, and also afterwards, we try to have a feedback by the participants to see how people felt the meeting. Because it's nice to have a nice program, but then you have to see if it really did give what it has to do.
Delivered what's on the tin, as they say. And do you see this process changing at all with the implementation? I imagine it would. How do you see that evolving now with the implementation of disclosure? Is this becoming more rigorous? Do you see it becoming more academic-based? How do you see the movement?
Well, when we look at UMS EAC CME, for instance, the first rules were quite simple. Now they are more and more complicated, and for instance, the transparency is one of the most important aspects, and disclosure of the conflict of interest of the different speakers, the organizers, is one of the key issues in the evaluation of the value of meetings. Also at national level, we try to find out if there is interest. For instance, if the organizer is also a presenter and a sponsor, there is a big problem there. So we look at this more and more strictly. And that there is an evolution, I think this is what happened. And it's not only in Europe, I think it's global. Also in other areas where you don't expect to see it, it starts to come.
And from your view, from Brussels, your sort of ivory tower view of the medical practitioner world, universe across Europe, how do you see this going from practitioner to practitioner, country to country? How is the process? I mean, obviously we've heard from Lodi. They were very early on in the Netherlands. And this gets into our second panel that we'll be discussing after the break, but how do you see this evolving from a practitioner perspective? How has this changed your role at CPME? And how do you see the dialogue moving? Has it moved in the last 24 months? How do you see this progressing country to country?
Well, it's a very difficult topic because the physicians are a little bit reluctant because they see it as a threat first. The first idea is it's a threat. We were used to do something before and now we have to change. And that's always the problem with change. People are afraid of every change. And at national level, you see also different approaches depending on the region in Europe. And for instance, in Nordic countries, it's more, let's say, accepted that people have views on what you get, while in the southern part of Europe, it's less accepted. So there are differences at that kind of level also. So the acceptance, let's say, I think that privacy issues in Finland are not the same as they are in Greece.
But then that would also explain why the Greece have gone a regulatory route and have decided to implement an actual legal regulation for this.
That could be one of the aspects, because I think, for instance, in Belgium now we try to do auto-regulation because we think that if we do it ourselves, I mean the industry, the healthcare professionals together, it will be better than if the authorities are doing it. That will be worse for us. But on the other hand,
not to comment on Belgian regulation or authorities.
No, it's a general principle about whatever, and in which country also it's.
Sure.
In Belgium, we have the advantage to have different governments, so we have more than one legislation. That's very nice.
Sometimes with a long pause in between them as well. So.
And I was happy to hear that you spoke about Brussels. You know, Brussels is the capital of Europe.
Certainement, monsieur. Certainement.
I know there are some French people here, and I don't think they will be so happy to hear that, but I like to say that.
Well, we could talk about that afterwards, perhaps over a coffee. If I can just bring Lodi in quickly, just to comment on something that Bernard said. This idea of the buy-in side, I want to go back to something you said about the 80% positive. When you did the survey, which is interesting because it parallels very well what the ABPI did in a survey, and the data is almost identical. Have you found any correlation between the doctors of the 80%? Are doctors who are doing more research more inclined to feel one way or another? Have you?
No, I don't think so. We didn't specifically look at that, and I look at Frederick, but I don't think there was a correlation or something that doctors in research had more problems or less problems with it. I think that it was evenly divided.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because increasingly the data in each of the European countries on the survey, it's interesting. They sort of line up. Well, obviously, the whole point of all of this is to increase trust. That should be the goal. And obviously, ultimately, this should deliver better patient outcomes. And I think we're very grateful to have Kees Smit here today, who's a well-known patient advocate.
My thanks from the organizers for the invitation to speak here today. On behalf of the European Patient Forum, and the European Patient Forum is an umbrella group of, let's say, 64 European disease-specific patient groups, as well as national umbrella patient groups. And EGAN is the European Genetic Alliances Network, focusing especially on genetic and most often rare diseases. And I think that I can say that on behalf of both organizations, we welcome the new pharma disclosure rules, as well as we earlier last year also welcomed the all-trial transparency initiative on clinical trials. Although patient groups today are not included in the topic which is discussed about pharma disclosure, we have to say that we have been engaged much earlier with EFPIA on, let's say, developing a code of practice on the relationships between pharma companies and patient groups in the past. So we developed already a code of practice in 2007, which was revised in 2011, and I think it will be revised also shortly. And also the European Patient Forum has been partner in a project on guiding principles for good governance in the pharma sector, which was initiated by DG Enterprise from the European Commission. And the aim of that was to develop a series of principles and core ethical values for all stakeholders. So we are not only working on, let's say, the relationship between pharma and patient groups, but also on the relationships between patient groups, pharma, as well as other stakeholders. And I think that when we talk about the relationships between pharma companies and patient groups, I also have to point out that I think we have a legitimate need to talk to each other. We as patient groups have the diseases and the pharma companies have the medications. So that makes it rather natural to talk with each other in the context of mutual respect and a strong framework that preserves the independence and autonomy of both parties. So there is a need for a set of clear and open rules on the exact nature of relationships between pharma companies, physicians, and health institutions, and that can definitely contribute to the needed levels of trust between all parties involved, the public at large, and especially consumers and more specific patients. I already told you about the guiding principles, which were developed and will be further developed. And that's based on the recognition by all participants of the need to go beyond bilateral relationships and to address the essential role of good governance in the pharmaceutical sector. And it might be useful also to mention here today that these practices, especially where it concerns individual patients and or patient groups, are regularly being criticized for our contacts with or funding by private companies. Or even worse, we are being criticized for being part of public-private partnerships, like within IMI, the Innovative Medicine Initiative. And as this is a quite transparent structure set up by the European Commission, it are still the patients who are being criticized for being part of these public-private cooperations, and we experienced that lately also in the German, maybe also in the coming months in the Belgian press, because of the fact that we started with the help of the European Commission and within the IMI initiative, a European Patient Academy. So patient groups are maybe, of all the groups where we are talking about, the most vulnerable for discussions on the exact source of funding than other parties. And this is also due to the fact that there is a fundamental lack of government policies in the European Union on how patient groups should be funded. And this counts as well for the European Commission, as well for EU member states. I summarized it on this slide. And there are two other issues I want to address here today. I think it's also relevant to mention it in the context of the discussions about closures and disclosures. And the first is the strict application of the rules that prohibit patients' advocates on national and international scientific congresses the entrance to the exhibition booth area of pharma companies, because we are no prescribers. To our feeling, this is disproportionate and also quite meaningless, as there are numerous opportunities for patient groups to meet with pharma representatives outside these congresses. And this is the example of the Cancer Congress in Amsterdam last year or 2 years ago. This was the protest demonstration against that exclusion. And the The second concern is the fact that these measures are being developed without or almost without consultation of patient groups. At least in the Netherlands, and I discussed it earlier with Lode, patient groups have at the moment no seat in the Dutch Commission with regard to advertising and promotion on drugs, where these measures are being discussed, and there is a strong wish among a number of Dutch patient groups to be part of these discussions, whereas the Dutch Patient and Consumer Federation, NPCF, is maybe more reluctant to take part in these discussions. So there is a certain difference of opinion on whether we should discuss this, yes or no, with the CGR. Finally, as a patient representative with more than 40 years of experience, I have to admit that when we want to regulate the relationship between healthcare professionals and pharma, we must not forget that it's maybe much more needed to regulate the often tight and most often very unclear relationships elsewhere in the healthcare sector, like for instance between government officials and patient groups, politicians and lobbying groups, or between committee members and healthcare institutions. It is especially in these relationships that I have witnessed more often very incorrect or intransparent behavior than in the disclosures of the relationships we discussed today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kees. There's at least 5 conferences and 4 books in what you said today. Thank you. Now, you bring, I think one of the key point of what you're saying is that the whole situation has become so jaundiced, there's even casting aspersions at the relationship with patient groups. And I think that just shows the need for greater transparency in general. And I think you've identified some of the core problems just because of the nature of the environment being so negative. And I appreciate that very much. Do you, just from your own perspective, do you feel that transparency in the current guise that it's presented and being implemented, will it improve treatment for your patient groups? Do you think it will improve treatment and trust? Do you feel that this is a good step at least to build bridges between the various actors in the value chain?
Well, I don't think that it will change a lot in the relationships. Maybe it will change a little bit in the relationship and the trust between at least the governments and pharma industry and healthcare providers. But I don't think it will take away the lack of trust within, let's say, some parts of the general public, some of the consumer groups, of some of the media. As I have witnessed it for over 40 years, I think when I was a student of economics, I think I read more or less the same content in books criticizing pharmaceutical industry than the books which were published last year.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a general lack of trust in, let's say, a number of industries, and I wonder if, let's say, all these disclosure measures will take that distrust away.
Is it a step in the right direction? I'm trying to get you to come a little here, Kees. I'm trying to get you to come just a bit.
Yeah, maybe it's a step in the good direction, but you also have to
okay,
realize
I'll take that.
That, for instance, for patient groups, it's very difficult to deal with these issues. I remember quite well we had a discussion about 4 or 5 years ago at the EFPIA offices about all the content of the different contracts between patient groups and pharma companies, and Eurordis, which is the European group working on rare diseases. They mentioned that they had more or less 70 or 80 contracts with different pharma companies, and all these contracts were not, let's say, in line with each other, contradicting each other, etc. And as patient groups, we don't have the legal people at our staff to handle with all these discussions and these regulations and these agreements properly. So that's a little bit the problem. So maybe the weakness of patient groups is also that maybe we cannot oversee all these agreements and policies and the implications, like the legal representative pointed out on the Data Protection Directive. Our interest in the Data Protection Directive is a totally different one, in the sense that we think it will inhibit medical research. And that's a totally different topic than the topic which have been discussed 20 minutes ago. So it's a very complex issue, and maybe it's a little bit a step forward, but
Yeah,
I have my doubts.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you very much. I think the key point is, and what we're hearing is that from the public side, there's an enormous lack of trust, and that I think we all agree that has evolved over many years. That just didn't happen, and there's a general agreement, which is why this initiative today, why we're all here, is to try and overcome those barriers and make things move forward. Now, we're going to open up the floor here for questions. I'd just like to, take my preference as chair here and say, I have one other question that I'd like to ask the panel. How do we get, and just going down the panel, how do we get the doctors, those doctors, that 20% who aren't buying in, how do we get them engaged? What do we need to do to get them buying into the process, complying? How do we make sure we get that process working? And I'll start with you, Lode. How do you see that occurring?
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think, first of all, transparency in general has become a very important professional value in the last, let's say, 15 years. So I guess that more and more doctors in the last 15 years have become aware of the importance of that, which also goes for the transparency of the disclosure of ties with the industry. And what you see is that I think it's a diminishing group of doctors, mostly probably elderly doctors, who have been used for a long time not to disclose anything. They are sort of fading out, let's say. So I mean, of course we have to address the point. We have to raise and maintain raising the awareness in all professionals. And do it broadly, not only for this issue, but broadly in transparency issue. But we also have to accept that not everyone will accept it. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, if like the code that we have is a code that, well, you can protest it, you can not agree with it, but you cannot opt out. I mean, that's an important thing. I mean, there's a contract. It's a mandatory. The disclosure is a mandatory part of the contract between industry and healthcare professional or healthcare organization. So you can protest it, but you cannot opt out. So I mean, I think that's an important backbone of the register and the disclosure code we have. So we just have to maintain that until this group of doctors has disappeared.
Wow. Okay, Karen. How do you see it?
I would say let's focus on the 80% instead of the 20%.
Okay.
And that's what we also see if I look at our Congress. We just checked it this week again. And then we see by repeating the message and make the rules very clear at an operational level, that 93% of the speakers at our Congress in Milan last year disclosed.
Yeah.
That should be 100. But it also means that if you're not disclosed, you're not in.
Yeah.
You exclude yourself.
And
so let's focus on the majority.
I suppose it's
instead of the
93% more than was 10 years ago, too, I suppose, in another way, too. Yeah. Anna.
I absolutely agree. And I think it has to be done a lot of work, and the doctors have to be convinced that's really in the common interest of both parties to disclose this, and this is really to increase the trust in this industry. And that's therefore really a value in the end for all doctors which will disclose, and that they should be in and therefore really do this.
Bernard.
Yeah, I think it will be difficult to convince people who don't want things. That's clear. You will have always people that are against the rules. But I think we have also to show and demonstrate that it's not a witch hunt, that we don't want to kill people or to put the people in jail, but just to show that it's a good thing to have a relationship with industry for the patient. Because how can the information come if the industry doesn't provide the means and the information? So it's a need to do it, but it has to be done in an ethical way, and you have to convince. It will not be easy.
Case.
Well, I think that although I don't have exact figures on that, most European and I think especially European patient groups, less the national patient groups, have disclosed their sources of funding. And maybe I also have to say that there are a number of patient groups who are totally not dependent on funding from pharma companies. In contrast, they are funding smaller biotech companies and pharma companies to develop a product, and therefore they do the fundraising. So that's a totally different situation, which is occurring also.
Thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, we have a question in the back, please. Please, we have cameras going today, obviously. We have microphones, so please state your name and your organization, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bogi Ferencik from Amgen Pharmaceutical. I have a question to Anna Britta, actually. Data privacy. Would you have any overview or summary or the consequences in the 34 countries which are impacted by EFPIA? Because I'm wondering, could I find out? Or would you look into each and every data privacy law, actually?
Yes, I would really make the look to the individual privacy law of the member states in this regard.
And Bernard, do you see, we discussed this earlier, you actually see quite divergent implementations going on.
Yeah, it depends on the country. Some are far ahead and some are behind and not really willing to do it. But I think a majority of countries have already implemented something.
Yes.
80%, maybe the same 80%. What I wanted to say also is that my problem is that we are concentrated on one kind of bias. It has been said by Case before, bias is not only industry. You can have all other kind of bias. For instance, academics, you can have the government can also bias things. So now we are concentrating on one kind of evil, but there are other ones.
Well, I think one evil at a time, this morning at least. I mean, I think we should put this into context. I mean, what's happened in Europe was predicated upon the Sunshine Act, which was a very aggressive regulation. As you probably can tell, part of me is American. Yeah, I don't know if you notice, I have a small American accent. So the Sunshine Act was passed 4 years ago in the United States, which basically required an immediate almost disclosure. And so there was almost a reaction globally because companies, if they had to do it one place, they had to do it everywhere. So there was sort of a rush to get this in. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the things we're discussing today, the lack of collaboration, the lack of discussion beforehand, were on the back end of this very quick passage of the Sunshine Act, this very aggressive legislation that went on in the United States. And part of the problem is that as it's gone on in the United States, it's actually not gone very well. If you look at the reaction about the database publishing, it's been very aggressive. Journalists have gone in and gone through trolling missions through some of the data. And this is exactly what we're trying to avoid in Europe, which is why we've been brought in, and other consultancies as well are trying to make sure that that does not happen, and that's why we're doing things like that today. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Frederick Schutte. I'm from the Dutch Foundation for the Code of Conduct on advertisement. So Lode is one of my board members. What I miss a bit in the whole discussion is the perspective for whom we disclose. Because I think that's important for the acceptance for everyone.
Sure.
Because of course we disclose for the patient. The patient has his distrust. The patient wants to know whether his or her doctor chooses for him or her or chooses for the company he has a relationship with. And when you think of that perspective, it can also be a mean to make the disclosure more acceptable for doctors, because they have a certain profession. a profession with some public, with a public interest. So with this public interest, it's within this profession that he should disclose his relations. We in the Netherlands choose also with our transparency register that the only way to look into the register is for the public to look for his doctor, and the public is not interested as except the journalist or maybe some others how much spending there is from industry to doctors on congresses or gifts or etc. No, the public wants to know whether the doctor has relations or not. So aggregated figures are not interesting at all, I think. And that's why we choose that the name of the doctor will be stated there, or the organization. And we also choose not for the consent in privacy law, that the doctor has to consent. It is like Lode said, but we choose for the justification of the balance of interest. And because, there is of course an interest for the doctor also. So every 10 euros is nonsense to disclose, but that's why we choose for a proportionate interest, and that's why we choose for this value of 500 euros per year cumulative. So if you have a relationship with a certain company of more than 500 euros cumulative per year, then it will be disclosed, otherwise not. So my questions are two. One to the lawyer. Do you think
The lawyer.
I'm also a lawyer, but another question to the lawyer, because you stated that national courts would not see this justification in the balance of interest. And I was thinking, well, how we choose it, what do you think about that? And maybe to the doctors, when we go from the perspective of the patient, do you think that that could be a mean for the doctors then to be more positive of disclosing?
Exactly. With regard to the first question, there are good arguments to say that this is based on the interest balance justification. The problem is that there should not be an overriding interest of the doctors, and if the doctors will argue that they do not want this disclosure, then it will be difficult to argue for a court that there's no overriding interest. It depends, and maybe the courts will also, the jurisdiction between the member states will differ. That might be possible, and I would not exclude this option, but the safe way would be the consent. And for Germany, I think they will not. It's not possible to rely on this interest balance justification. Authorities and courts will not follow this argumentation. But I absolutely agree there are good arguments for this justification base.
Anna, in Germany, will it be by doctor or will it be aggregate?
Yes. We will make the aggregated disclosure if he will not consent.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So you have an optional level of disclosure?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the second aspect is, yes, I think there are very good arguments, and that's the meaning, or that's the reason why we have to try to convince these doctors that it is really in their interest. And I think the response quotes of some companies are very good, and 20% of refusal it's in the end, it's a very good quote at the beginning of this process. And I think it would be possible to get a higher quote of consent if you really try to argue in this manner. And it's exactly the way that we do this for the patient, and not with regard to do any negative with regard to the pharmaceutical industry. It's only in the interest of the patient and to disclose what the doctor as such has disclosed. And therefore, the reason that we disclose in the country where the HCP is seated is also an argument for this, because we do not disclose for a pharmaceutical company on the complete transfer of values granted, but we disclose in the respective seat country of the HCP to enable the patient in the seat country to see what the doctor has been received from any company within the European community. And therefore, I'm absolutely agree with this approach. And it can be used in the communication to convince and to try to obtain a very high level of consent.
Okay, we'll start with Lodi, and then the second question, getting back to patient trust, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's Maybe I wasn't elaborate enough, but I think I already said something about transparency in general. And transparency has two meanings. I think it's a quality requirement, and it's also a requirement for the public accountability of what professionals do. So in that respect, I think, and that's in line with what Frederick said, it is a means of addressing doctors about the importance of disclosure. And I think it works, but we never know, and I agree with Bernard that you shouldn't try to convince everyone, but try to convince the majority who believe in it.
Bernard?
It's true. We will never get everybody on board, but we have to have a majority. And I think aggregated information doesn't mean anything, because if you don't know who and what's the meaning of it. On the other hand, my question always is there a link between the amount and the fact that you are bound to a company? Some people are maybe more influenced by a small amount than by a big amount. And sometimes you see a lot of money because the guy or the lady went to many congresses. But maybe it's a good thing because maybe he or she learned a lot. Yeah. Well, if they have a small amount, maybe it's not good. So it's a little bit a strange relationship.
And Kees, again.
Yeah. Well, Frederick started to say that this is also done for patients. I must say that in the context of this invitation, I try to figure out at the Dutch Transparency Register as a patient with whom my physicians have contact with as pharma companies or other relations. And I must say that I didn't got any information because I did not know the place where my physician lived, and I also did not know the big number which was needed to get access to this transparency register. So when patients wanted to have access, let's say, to these transparency registers, I think there should be changed something in their advantage as that they have more easy access to these data.
Question, yes.
Hi. Is it working? Yes.
Yes, it is.
François Haas from UCB. A question for Mr. Smith. What, for you, from your perspective or from a patient group or patient advocate's perspective, what would help to rebuild the trust of patients to the pharma industry? Because as I understand, you're not, I would say, so sure that transparency will be so helpful. So what would really help to rebuild this trust or to improve the trust?
Well, I think in general, and maybe I haven't said it so clear, is that I think there is enough trust between, let's say, patient groups, pharma companies and physicians about these mutual relationships. So I don't think that in our groups there is so much distrust. The distrust is maybe at the public at large, consumer groups like Health Action International, and maybe the media. And I think when there are conflicts, these parties are not talking with each other about the exact nature of their relationship. It's a lot of gossiping without checking facts, and not asking for arguments why we are talking with pharma companies, why we are cooperating with physicians, researchers, etc.
Question, yes. Again, please state your name and your organization, please.
Good morning, I'm Astrid van Gansenwinkel from SOBI. My question is from a pharmaceutical industry point of view. I think in most cases we are the persons making the contracts or setting up the contract text with the physicians. And I think broadly you have two situations, one in which the company has a legal entity in the country, and another situation in which the physician might have a contract with a head office of the company in another country. And in that case, I understood that the responsibility of reporting the relationship in a system is more with the physician. And my question is, or more maybe a suggestion, is that it would be, I think, helpful to have some kind of standardized text to be implemented in contracts to state this informed consent part, to disclose the personal data, and also to point out who is responsible for reporting that in the system. And I think if it would be possible for each country to have some kind of suggested text for contracts, you also would create some kind of uniformity, which is also clearer towards physicians, instead of having each individual company create their own contracts with their own text on informed consent disclosure. So it's a question and maybe an advice in one.
Yeah, the disclosure code is being implemented now is on a country-by-country basis, and some countries are being led by industries, some have a central database, some have doctor-led. Anna, that sounds like a legal question. How are your perspectives on the various contracting regulations and ownership and value chain assessments?
First thing, in Germany, for example, we have a sample consent declaration which have been distributed by the FSR, and Holger, I think you will say something in the second panel. That enables that the companies are using more or less the same template within Germany, and from our experience, the acceptance is very good because the physician sees it's more or less the same with regard to each country, with regard to each company, and therefore the acceptance is very high because we have this unique form. And the other thing, we are advising international firms, of course, and we are also preparing consents for international relationships, which can be used by each individual company within different countries, and only modified with regard to specific clauses, or also with an annex, so that a unique consent can be used by each individual country, and there's no amendment required, because there's of course a need to cover this international transfer requirement, or this cross-border relationships, because if you have to disclose in the country where the HCP is seated, that does not, and on the other hand, the contractual relationship is with another country, or then of course the country where the company is seated, which grant the transfer of value, has to obtain the consent, because this company has a contractual relationship with the HCP. But on the other hand, the disclosure requirements, there in this regard, the disclosure code of the country where the HCP is seated are relevant. Therefore, you have to make in any way a communication between both countries to enable that everything is done. But therefore, it's very complicated in the end to prepare this consent. But that's why the implementation, also from a legal perspective, is not so easy. But we are working on this, and I think there are very good options to obtain this consent and to make it in a very good way, so that it's not that the HCPs accept this, and that they think it's a good way. And I think that's the challenge. We have to make it in a user-friendly way to increase the acceptance quotes.
We could probably go on for another hour on this topic, but we have another session, and I'd like to give everyone their break, unfortunately. So please come up afterwards if you have a question. We're going to take a 10-minute coffee break now, just a short break to reset cameras and things like that. Thank you all very much. Please thank the panel. Very interesting panel. Thank you, everyone.